wanted to say thank you, Sarah, for agreeing to do this interview after our seminar at San Jose State. And just for people viewing this video, the reason that the setting was a little different, not Sarah's classroom, but a university classroom, is because she's very kindly agreed to do the interview after our recent seminar for our Phase 2 students. So again, if you could start by just saying what you focused on for the PAC teaching event and how you would, at least at this point, assess how that PAC teaching event went.
So my PAC event focused on the students writing a narrative essay about a personal experience from their life. And that it served as the summative assessment. And then during the week of the teaching event, we had scaffolded activities to build up to writing that essay.
And the grade level of the students?
Oh, it's a 7th grade language arts class.
There we go.
Yes. So we started right from the basics of forming your main idea, forming a thesis statement, having a lesson learned from that main idea included in the thesis statement, because that was an important component I focused on for the narrative. And then building from there a sequence of events and including descriptive language to make it a full, complex story.
Did you also find that you were asking your students to create what was essentially a storyboard?
Yes.
For their narrative sequence?
Yes. We did it both in written form and in visual form.
Right.
So I had them write out a sequence of events with some details, and then I also had them draw it out to help with some of the descriptive sensory details.
Right. And just because I haven't asked you this before, how did you find the storyboard part of that sequence of activities worked in relation to what I know one of your goals was, and that was to increase the students' capacity to describe what the event was that was their learning experience?
There was actually a direct correlation between the students who took time and effort on their drawings and had very nice descriptive language in their essays, and those who rushed through it didn't add any color and had very little descriptive language.
Right.
So that was very apparent right away.
So you're going to remember to talk about that
when
you do your task 5 reflection.
Yes, I will definitely be talking about that.
Good. That's a very inventive step. For the narrative description. I've seen it very rarely. I've seen storyboards used in a lot of different contexts, because of course it comes out of how we put together both film as well as animated sequences. But I've actually never seen it used as part of a series of steps leading up to the writing of a narrative essay. So
my thought process kind of behind it was to help support my visual learners. And I have a lot of artistic kids who like to draw, and they're very skilled at that. So I wanted to give them an opportunity to visualize their story in a different medium and not just in words. Right.
At the same time that I was observing you teaching that narrative component, I was also observing another supervisee teaching Sherman Alexie's The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, and he was fortunate in joining up with someone who was actually quite skilled visually. So the narrative there is actually a narrative of a young man who draws as well as experiences things. And the drawing, as you might suspect, contributes enormously to the effectiveness of the story. So, and I suppose that the larger world that your students are a part of would understand narrative as almost by definition involving both a visual element as well as a verbal narrative, a print narrative element.
One thing that I tried to stress from the beginning with looking at a narrative is that you are retelling a story in an event. And so as much detail that you can remember and include, the better you're telling that story and painting that picture.
Nice.
So that's why I did focus so much on visuals, to kind of inspire them to not just write down, I went to eat a hot dog with my dad. It was cool. But the hot dog tasted amazing, and I got mustard on my face, and my dad was laughing at me. All those visual details to spark the writing details.
Right. When you used Russell Baker's
No gumption
essay, were students aware of, or did they respond to the visual dimension of that
yes,
essay?
Very much so.
And did it help to have that as a model for them, or wasn't it? Didn't it directly transfer?
No, it did help. I think the way that he used a lot of his language, they understood it, and some I could tell were kind of trying to model theirs in a similar fashion.
Oh, nice.
Sometimes it was including humor in a story that might not normally have it, and that was one thing that I was so proud of, and that surprised me was, some of these stories, they were able to put in a little humor that I wasn't expecting, and I feel like they kind of took that from No Gumption. Yeah,
and that's, as you know, that's a fairly sophisticated level of writing achievement.
Very much.
When you can talk about serious topics and talk about them with that element of humor, it really represents a way to gain a much wider readership, as Russell Baker has demonstrated.
Yes.
and also just present your story in a much more convincing and memorable way.
Yeah.
So now that you've had a chance to read over all of the students' essays, have you handed them back
yes.
to the students? That happened last week?
Monday of this week.
Monday of this week, of course, yeah. So now that you've had a chance to step back, what would you absolutely want to do the next time you taught a similar unit? What would you want to do a little differently, or maybe not do at all?
So one of the things that I did need to focus on for this was preparing them for a district writing test.
Yes.
And part of that is including in the writing format your thesis right up front in your introductory paragraphs. And even though
which as we mentioned is done by no good writer ever.
Well, for an argumentative essay, it's perfect, and they're used to that. But for a narrative essay, no, it's not natural.
Right.
And so,
actually, very few argumentative essays put this.
Well, okay, that's the process that the district really likes, and so the school does focus on that frame of writing your essay that way. Right. So I did need to prepare them for that, and I did not stress that clearly for my kids' essays, because one pattern I noticed was that many of them had an amazing thesis and lesson learned that came at the end, which of course flowed beautifully throughout their writing, and they were some of the strongest papers, but it was at the end, and part of the requirement was that it needed to be stated clearly up front for the reader.
So you weren't able to evaluate those papers as highly.
Correct. I did have to take points off, but I also feel like I did not pay enough attention. I didn't prime them for that as much as it really needed.
It might be worth taking that up with the district, actually, in terms of how they're structuring their form of assessment. Because, any credible teacher of writing, or just a good writer who talks about, how to write well, whether it's Stephen King or Russell Baker or anyone, what they'll say is what you want to do at the beginning is have a good hook. You'll want to draw the reader in, but none of them say anything about a thesis.
No, and that's the thing, is we did discuss hooks as well, and so that they were clearly able to master.
Yes.
So they understand naturally how it should have flowed, which was where I was very happy with it. And so that was just a weird quirk that isn't natural, that I would, if I have to do it that way, I would focus on it.
Right. Just make sure that students know, and I think as we discussed this afternoon, you can always say, this is not something that you will see when you read short narrative essays of the sort that might be considered very good models for your writing, nor is it something that I myself advocate, but it is something that will increase your evaluation at the district level, and you know that the majority of your students are very concerned.
They are. It's a painful thing that all students go through, and mine really like to make sure they're doing the best of what's asked of them.
Right. Is there anything finally that you'd like to say about your final assessment of the unit? Again, things that you absolutely want to do well second time, things that you're really proud of that students did, like the inclusion of humor, or things that you definitely want to tweak and maybe even draw?
Definitely the level of detail that I was really looking for.
Right.
We touched on it, and some students that was enough, and they were able to include it, and they had that sense. But many of my students, they would maybe add a few little details here and there, salt and pepper it in, but their stories were still kind of unclear, very dry, very clinical reports of the day.
Yes.
And so...
sometimes called 9 to 5.
Yes, exactly. Instead of telling a story. So that's definitely something that I would go back and spend more time on.
Right.
And figure out maybe a different scaffolded activity that would better prep them than what I did use for it, because it was a good start, but it wasn't enough.
Yeah. Well, just to compliment you and conclude the interview, there's nothing that is, in my experience, a better predictor of a successful career in teaching than receiving a group of student papers that surprise and please you. So I'm sure you're off to a very good start.
Thank you.